I can see how the trajectory of the day has gone from the Arctic to the future of democracy to the uncomplicated issues of the Middle East to the most consequential bilateral relationship and strategic competition in the world. So hopefully we get through this and they'll give you sufficient appetite for your lunch. We have an absolutely terrific panel here this morning. Just immediately to my left, we have Deborah Wince-Smith, who's the head of the Council for Competitiveness. Again, full details in bio. She's had White House positions, First Assistant Secretary of Technology Policy in the Department of Commerce, and on, so wonderful and welcome. We have an old colleague, friend of mine, Robert Daly from the Wilson Center, former Foreign Service officer, served at the embassy in Beijing, translated, and I'm sure without a single mistake, for Jiang Zemin and, was it Jimmy Carter?
Carter and Kissinger.
And Carter and Kissinger. So, linguist, Foreign Service officer, scholar, actor, theater person. Robert, great to see you. And we have our colleague Tom Hardy from the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. He has long innings in the field of commerce, trade, both USTDA and on the Hill, working on the House Ways and Means Committee. Tom, great to have you here. So again, full bios in this session. In order to maximize time to get out to the floor and get questions from all of you who've traveled out here, let me start with kind of a softball, but a really scene-setting, frame-setting question, which is, from your experience, expertise, and your organization, what is this competition about? And how is it being prosecuted, as it were, from your constituency and stakeholders?
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and this is indeed, I think, a topic that not only is at the heart of the future for the United States and our allies around the world, but the world at large. I'll make 3 points about what's going on in the U.S.-China strategic relationship, and I want to encompass the economic dimension, but also national security. And it's really the Super Bowl of competition, because Beijing sees its competition with the United States as the way it will move forward to reshape the global order, not just in terms of our political systems, but technologically as well as in the military sense. It really seeks to unseat the United States as the world's geopolitical leader, and the race for this future is going to depend, and already is, on technology. It's a technology competition. Back in 2017, Chairman Xi said, whoever controls AI will control the world. And he was also supported in that comment by Putin. He also articulated what the Chinese call civil-military fusion. And this is something that at the work of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness, where we're focused on how to drive the productivity, prosperity, and security of the United States, every one of the technological transformations that are underway, from obviously AI at the forefront, but in biotechnology, in space, in genetics, they are all dual-use technologies. They are no longer just applying to commercial activity. They have huge military applications. So China is now using every tool in its arsenal to move forward in this technological competition in concert with using all the world organizations to fulfill their ambitions. So ironically, China, and I work a lot on this for many, many years, China is a major, major perpetrator of the most massive theft of intellectual property ever in human history. I have the numbers for any of you who are interested. I know the scale and scope. I serve on the Commission for the Theft of American Intellectual Property, and it is massive. And they use cyber attacks to acquire this. But they had the International Intellectual Property Organization in the UN. So it's sort of an oxymoron then. But also, Beijing is very aggressive in infiltrating all of our technology and science institutions, our universities, and our companies. Back in 2011, and I'll stop after this one anecdote, I was on the board of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is one of our great national security labs in California, and I was with a small group, and we visited in the emerging supercomputing facilities in China after they had visited ours, every single person working at these complexes had come from Intel, IBM, Microsoft, ENC. We had trained and educated everyone who was then building their capability. Now, they have done a tremendous job in leapfrogging into leadership in supercomputing, and they no longer participate in some of the international benchmarks because they don't want the rest of the world to know the progress they have made. But they have attained all of that from involvement in every dimension of the U.S. economy. So the competition is the Super Bowl of competition. It's civilian and military. Technology is the name of the game. And 3, they're using all the instruments of the global environment to reshape the rules of the economy, including standard setting and many other things we'll talk about in the discussion. But this is the issue for the future of our democracy, our liberal society, and our allies around the world. And also, I would say, the developing world, because we can talk about what's going on in Africa and Latin America and the rest of the world.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks so much. Over to you, Robert, for your perspective. And hopefully, because Robert spent so much time in China as well, can give us some flavor of Chinese perspectives on these competitions.
I'd be glad to. Thank you, and thanks for having me today. I've been with many World Affairs Councils over the past decade and have benefited from it greatly. I was in Naples and Jacksonville earlier this year. In February, I'll be out with the Foothills Group in Denver as well as in Colorado Springs. So I look forward to all of these discussions. I'll begin exactly where Deborah began. Satu, you asked what's at stake here. Ultimately, it is about global systems, global order, the security architectures, the trade and financial arrangements, the technological arrangements, the ways that we work with each other. I agree strongly, and I would actually go a step further. This isn't only a competition. I actually think that the most accurate framework for looking at it is to understand that we are already engaged in a new kind of Cold War. I don't say that as a hawk who's been waiting to say it for decades. I don't delight in that. This is a tragedy. Like the other Cold War, it's going to be protracted. It will take several decades. It is going to be dangerous, expensive, and wasteful. But here we are. I think that is, in fact, the most accurate framework for all of the reasons that Deborah just mentioned. I would like to give a little bit of the Chinese view on this. I was just in China itself for 3 weeks, and then at a conference last week with a high-level Chinese delegation, again in Colorado Springs, where we got to debrief with them. China has a very different narrative. We tend to tell this as a story of China's aiming to do things to us. China is doing things for themselves. We happen to be in their way, and so this involves doing things that definitely involve us, but they're not coming for America in the first instance. So the way that China tells its story, and it won't surprise you to know that China's story, China's narrative, like the American narrative, is a virtue narrative. They don't think they're the bad guys. They have a virtue narrative too. It is the story of, for them, the most accomplished civilization in human history. This is not that easy to argue against. If you go far enough back, it's a tremendously accomplished place that also had a long, deep fall from which it has a festering ego wound that it still hasn't recovered from. This goes back to the Opium War of the 1900s. But now it's a rise story. And so the way China would describe its interest in shaping global order is that China has, through its own hard work, now there's been a lot of theft, but there's also been a lot of hard work. You have to tip your cap. That China has pulled itself up from being the sick man of Asia to being the second richest, most powerful nation on earth, mostly through its own hard work, through adaptivity, through entrepreneurialism, increasingly through innovation. Yes, a lot of theft, but increasingly also innovation. We used to say for a long time that it's merely imitative, not innovative. Wrong. We've underestimated them again and again and again, and we're doing it now. And China would say that it is only as a developing country trying to increase the welfare of the Chinese people, and that this is a moral good, right? 850 million people out of absolute poverty. It's never been done anywhere else. And now, again, this is China's telling of its story, that China has wealth. China is doing what any country would do, and what America has done more successfully than any other nation, which is to translate its wealth into influence. Of course you want to do this. Once you have wealth, you want to shape the global environment in which you operate. You push your defensive perimeters outward. America has pushed its defensive perimeters so far outward that they comprise the entire globe. We have a policy that we can't allow the emergence of any regional hegemon. So China is saying we have a right to our security in the Western Pacific, our own backyard. Now it happens that the resident power is us. So they see us as being standing between them and achievement of their righteous and necessary goals. So they don't aim at us in the first instance because they're no goodniks. They aim at us because they're trying to get a form of global power and influence comparable to what America had after World War II. And they see us as the resident superpower, very much squatted on their doorstep. They understand they've benefited from the Pax Americana since World War II, and their attitude is, thank you very much, America. Yes, our economic development has depended in part on you. The exit's over there. We've got this now. Okay, and I just want to propose to you that while this does present a major challenge to us, one that we have to meet, it's a coherent narrative. It's not surprising. It's not in itself nefarious. It's what countries do. The problem is, what does China want to do with power? What does it think is the relationship between nations and individuals? This is where we get into, again, the global order problem. But we need to understand that China has this virtue narrative because, while it isn't very convincing here in Washington, it is convincing in much of the rest of the world, especially among emerging economies that would like to do what China did. So we need to stay aware of this and not simply paint China with too black a brush, even though, as I say, I think that it is a Cold War and that there's a great deal at stake and that we have to bring a great deal of attention to this. And then just the last note, if it's true that this is ultimately about global order, I think that we face a question now about whether America is still in the global order game, which involves cooperation, working with allies, incurring expenses to provide global public goods, sometimes incurring expenses for the sake of the system itself, with a long-term view. This has been the Republican and Democratic consensus of all of our presidents since World War II. Are we still in the global order game? Or just as China's on the cusp, are we inclined to take our toys and go home? I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that I'll certainly be watching. Thank you.
Robert, thanks so much. And the theme of this conference, World Affairs Council, is, of course, seeing from the other side. So it's very useful to have that on the table as we go through what's the nature of this competition. Tom, do you want to talk about it, given all the work you're doing and for U.S. companies in emerging markets where China competes with us?
Sure. Thank you very much. Tom Hardy from the U.S. Trade Development Agency. It's really a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation to be here. We were fortunate to have the World Affairs Council host our director in New Hampshire about a month and a half ago, and she came back raving about the opportunity to talk to New Hampshire-based companies, and really appreciate that forum and appreciate the opportunity to be here. Let me take a little bit different spin. As opposed to talk about TDA, let me talk about what's at stake and what the challenges I see as U.S. TDA. I think the Belt and Road Initiative has been around for a while. It continues to transform the geostrategic economic competition between the United States and China. The initiative's paving the way for Chinese companies and the Chinese state, which often are one and the same, to prepare, develop, and finance infrastructure in emerging markets, and do it in a way that locks Chinese goods, services, and standards in place for decades. That is what's at stake. That is the challenge we face every single day. And it's a vicious cycle. The more they do, the more often they succeed, the more likely that China is going to be form the basis of future infrastructure development for the long term. What does that mean? The more China gets locked into these emerging markets as the preferred supplier, it forecloses exports of U.S. goods and services. It reduces our competitiveness and makes us on the back foot as opposed to be leaning in, which is where our partners in emerging markets have long turn to, which is U.S. technology, U.S. goods and services of not just the United States, but like-minded partners as well. I think that's what gets us to where we are now, which is needing to push back and needing to push back hard. And as was said, getting in the way. I think that as we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, and I can talk more than TDA, and we can later in the discussion, but from TDA's perspective, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency is on the front line of helping our partners in emerging markets design the infrastructure. We have grant-based funding that is designed specifically to provide an avenue for American engineering companies to go into these emerging markets and help design the priority infrastructure developments in these markets. What does that mean? That means American standards are being brought into place. That means financing that isn't state finance from China is being considered in the beginning of the process. Through feasibility studies, technical assistance, and going so far as co-financing the deployment of U.S. goods and services and technologies in emerging markets, we're able to demonstrate the benefit that U.S. companies and U.S. Technology providers can bring to a partner country. Sometimes it's more expensive for certain, but what they do see is a partner that is not looking at the quick sale. These contracts have long-term O&M contracts, warranties. It's a longer-term commitment. And I think that that's what USTDA is doing, is on the front lines, using that project preparation assistance. It's helping markets, in emerging markets, meet their target goals for infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, think major infrastructure projects, energy projects, transportation, digital infrastructure, and healthcare projects that are the foundations for long-term economic growth in these emerging markets. And fortunate, I've been with USTDA for a long time. I can talk a lot about where we've succeeded, and I look forward to getting into those conversations because we are winning, but we need to continue to have an eye towards pushing back strongly against China's longer-term vision of encroachment in emerging markets.
Thanks very much, Tom. All of you have spoken about the depth, the scale, and the range of what this competition looks like and the stakes, global order, future of our ability to be in places if China sets the rules, standards, feeds us out. But I want to turn to this specific question of, we have an incoming administration after January 20th, and Robert kind of touched on it. Are we in the game anymore? Are we going, yes, there's a Cold War, there's a competition, but are we willing to play it? Last time we were, and we were able to do lots of innovative things, lots of forward-leading things, but we seem to be at a juncture in our country where we may or may not want to play by some of those earlier tool sets, take them out of our toolbox and use them. Free trade agreements, external support, reshoring instead of sending our companies out, supporting our companies to go out, setting the standards globally, using international organizations to advance our positions and our position. So what is next? Or is competition going to lead to disconnection between US and China, therefore leaving much of the world open to China and less open to us because we're going to focus on home? Please.
Well, one thing I think that's going to accelerate, irrespective of who won our presidential election, is the AUKUS Plus partnership and the whole shift to the Indo-Pacific and the alliances, because...
You might want to just explain AUKUS too.
So this was the initiative that started with the UK, Australia, and the United States, initially around a nuclear submarine procurement. But it's really expanded into a very strategic partnership. And now, you know, with what happened in Ukraine, I mean, let's just remember, who would have ever thought a few years ago Japan would have changed its constitution to now, you know, be it in really remilitarize, as well as Sweden becoming part of NATO. But the AUKUS Plus is really the expansion of that alliance to include Japan, Korea, and I think India will come in very shortly. They still have their love affair right now with Russia that's historic, and we all know that, but I think they will be part of it. that's a very strategic reordering of alliances, and it's going to, it's already occurring both in terms of trade, investment, and technology. You know, one of the other fronts, in addition to the AI, is in quantum computing, and it's interesting that during COVID, and I unfortunately get to hear about a lot of these. We had massive increase in cybersecurity attacks during COVID from China because they were trying to get the understanding on the virus and the pharmaceutical thing. But with quantum computing, you know, we're going to curtail a lot of that. So that's another frontier. But I think that alliance is going to be very, very strategic. In the case of Europe, and I just came from Europe, Europe is very close to losing its auto industry. I mean, I don't know how many of you have heard of this Draghi report that just came out recently on European competitiveness. They have very low productivity. Their industry, really, with a few exceptions, is not in the mainstream. They, in many ways, I mean, it's sad to see, but in some ways they're declining society, and they don't have the capacity. You know, most of these countries can't even pay their 2% for NATO. So I think with the few exceptions in Europe, and I would include France coming into this, the alliances that we're going to deal with vis-a-vis China are going to be the Indo-Pacific. The other part of the world that's very strategic we need to focus on is Africa. And I have many colleagues. We're creating an all-Africa competitiveness forum. They want to collaborate and work with the United States as partners, not as aid recipients. This is a very different thing. And I think under whoever now becomes our leaders in the new Trump administration, having a focus on Africa and a renewed focus on Latin America is absolutely critical. And I think that will happen. I also want to comment a little bit about the AI ethics issue. There's a lot of work underway on creating the standards and regulation for AI. And this is a Trojan horse. I was recently at a meeting with some Chinese leaders who were talking about, well, we need ethics in AI. What do they mean by ethics in AI? What they mean is all of the data that's being accessed in the world to create these large language models, they have access to. But the data in their economy, in their world, is completely shut. There's no access to that. And they are using AI in a very deleterious human way. And I'll just give the example. We all know what's happening to the Uyghurs in Western China. But what many may not know, that is the first human laboratory in the world for complete control of human beings. Their biology, their mental activity, their ability to move, to act, all being controlled by AI systems coupled to biological controls, and it's a laboratory for total authoritarian control of human beings. That, to me, is one of the scariest things underway because we are about 6 months away from what experts are saying is superintelligence in AI. So how we're going to deal with that and all these other things is absolutely, I think, at the top of the agenda. But in terms of the alliances, the Indo-Pacific, and I would include Canada also in that sweep that we're talking about. I thought we would include Brazil. Brazil is, you know, largest important country in Latin America, but they have turned very swiftly now to Xi under Lula. And all my colleagues and friends in Brazil are kind of sick over that, to tell you the truth.
Well, thank you. I mean, there was a recent map in one of the newspapers that showed on the eve of the APEC meeting in Peru, all of the countries in South and Latin America that had China as their #1 trade partner. And of course, Xi went to Peru on the sidelines of APEC, announced the new port. And friends of mine from Asia wrote and said, see, this is the kind of thing that our public see, which is, whether it's right or wrong, leave aside the details. What they see is, what they hear is, China just gave another port to Peru. We'd like to be part of that. How can we be part of that?
And how many ports does China have now? Over 100, circling the entire globe.
That's right. Robert, over to you and then to Tom on this question of what's next, both in terms of U.S. politics or in other ways that you see it.
Well, I'm not too worried that we're going to fall down on the deterrence piece. AUKUS is very important. The shift in Japan's doctrine is key. Japan and South Korea tentatively healing some of their breaches. That's not yet locked in. but the Quad is more active. NATO is seeing an Asian-based mission now. So I think that in terms of traditional deterrence, that we've put some points on the board, and that China has really noticed. But that's not all there is to this. There is the trade piece. You know, we dropped out of TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have put more or less American standards in place throughout a lot of the Asia-Pacific, not all of it. China wasn't going to be in, although they now applied to join. We have said, well, we can't do that. That's just a given. You can't do free trade agreements. We haven't done nearly as much in the region as we could diplomatically. And in general terms of provision of global public goods and other kinds of leadership, even in the broadly cultural and values-based or ideological side, where we have tremendous advantages over China, we haven't done as much. And so I worry about what it says about our long-term positioning for what is ultimately a global order competition. And a global order is about how we live. It's about human beings, how we live. The deterrence piece is very, very important. But what does it say about us that we find the deterrence piece the easiest to do, despite the fact that it's both the most expensive and the most escalatory?
And the most
Escalatory. But, you know, free trade agreements, TPP, oh, no, that's dead on arrival. Well, why is it dead on arrival? Why aren't we fighting for this? So the Trump administration, we're getting into predictions now, dangerous territory. But I think that there's going to be an evolution on this. I think that the instincts going in are America first, isolationism. And we have different views on that, I'm sure, but we all know roughly what it means. The difficulty that they have conceptually is that many of the people working for Trump actually remain American primacists. They believe in American primacy. They believe in the post-World War II dispensation. And even the president and his closest advisors, if we look at the first Trump administration, while they speak an isolationist game, there is still a strong assumption that if they choose to act internationally, America still strides the world like a colossus a la 1949, or post-Cold War. That's not true. The world really has changed. And so I think that you'll see isolationism, you will see China continuing to make these gains in Africa, in Latin America, the ports, shipbuilding, a number of areas, absolutely vital, and it will be brought home to us, know that actually America is on the face of the globe and we need to be clear about our global role. So I would look for a pulling in, considerable Chinese gains, and then a rediscovery in some new mode of America's global role, because we remain primacists even though we bridle at aspects of that. China knows this, and they're ready to move now. They've already said that they're the natural leader of the global south. I would dispute that strongly, but this is a big push that they are making. Xi Jinping, as he did before the first Trump inauguration, will be giving a speech at Davos in which he makes this speech to, again, a frightened world, a world that's maybe more frightened than it was in early 2017. China's on the move and very programmatic, and we're going to have to come around to the totality of the global order and our own engagement. What is the meaning of our power? What do we want to do? But I think there's going to be a dip and a Chinese rise before we come around.
I think that's an important point, and I just lay on the table that one of the key things that worries me about that delta, that gap, is how long it lasts. Because the world is changing so quickly, those norms, rules, standards, and agreements, which for example, specifically to raise the issue you raised, TPP, theoretically, if we pull back, let's say for a period of 4 to 6 years or 4 to 8 years, TPP could move forward without us.
Or with China.
And include China, and therefore we would be locked out essentially with China as a member. And that's that delta I worry about, even if you have this hopeful picture. And that's my worry. Tom, over to you.
Let me be careful how I describe, but I will start by saying clearly the Senator Rubio's recognizes very clearly the geostrategic, geopolitical.
He's a primacist.
Yes. Congressman Waltz, who's been announced for National Security Advisor, likewise recognizes the geopolitical, geoeconomic challenge. I will maybe put a rose-colored glasses on, but I think it's worth remembering in Trump 1.0, Ex-Im Bank was closed down. They had no board. President Trump fought to reopen them, gave them more authorities. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, had been around for 30 years, had not been reimagined. It reimagines the DFC, it got new authorities, got bigger budget. These are two of the bigger tools that we have. Likewise, the U.S. Trade Development Agency was turned to time and again to lead the effort on infrastructure development in some measure to support the pipeline for Ex-Im and DFC's financing. But with that turn to USTDA, we opened up offices throughout the Indo-Pacific to achieve the President's Indo-Pacific strategy, looking at free and open Indo-Pacific. So even when we talk about where is it going, I really appreciate your point as that, yes, there will be challenges, but there is a focus on the U.S. primacy. And even when you say what's happening, you can look at what happened to DFC, you can look at what happened to Ex-Im, you can look at what happened to the U.S. Trade Development Agency. Each of them grew, expanded, and focused on how do we put American innovation at the forefront, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Latin America, particularly across the Indo-Pacific, where for us, it's given us opportunity to work in Pacific Island nations we've never worked in. But we recognize through that Indo-Pacific strategy the critical importance of these countries throughout the Indo-Pacific Islands and providing them an alternative to the Chinese model.
Robert, you had a question first.
Two questions. OPIC, DFC, Ex-Im Bank, all very important. How effective can they be if we're tariffing everybody at 10 or 20% is one question. And then the second question is, how do we match up actually dollar to dollar on project dollars out the door? I mean, Chinese, it's all lending at commercial rates. This isn't aid, right? But they tend to be there and active. As you mentioned, the new port of Chancay in Peru. How really do we measure up, or is it a quality versus quantity competition?
And Tom, on that question of dollar to dollar, we've made some attempts to do this, but it's difficult because we have a very private sector orientation. So the dollars are harder to measure if a company decides to expand a facility or a part of a port, or it's just harder because they make independent corporate decisions. So maybe you want to.
Yeah, I don't know how much I'll take the dollar for dollar. I think there's no doubt that what we have with Ex-Im and DFC doesn't match what China has, whether it's through state and enterprise financing or just the government itself really putting money behind the BRI. But what we do have is new tools to help American companies that we didn't have before. We need to, I think about DFC, they now have equity authority, something they talked about for a long time of needing. That is a new tool, again, looking at how do we take on this growing economic challenge and what do we need to do to change. I think that's where I would point to, is that we have made changes dollar for dollar. We just don't compete dollar for dollar because we've got a different model. As Satu said, it's private sector led versus state-owned government led.
Say that last bit.
Sorry, that went down. I think the model of the United States is just different. We're private sector led. We can't compete dollar for dollar where China is investing as a government, where the U.S. government is supporting private sector development. So it's just a different model, but the authorities are new and expanded to do what we can with what we have to make U.S. more competitive in emerging markets and demonstrate U.S. leadership in emerging markets.
Deborah, you want to comment?
I would just say also, though, that a lot of countries are very wary now of the debt trap that has occurred through the debt financing model, and a lot of the shoddy infrastructure that has been built. I mean, this is particularly true in Africa. And I'll just give one example. One of your board members, Nicole Perry, and I've talked about this. When China took over the port of Piraeus, which was pretty shocking because no one in Europe stood up, when they were forcing the privatization of Greek government assets to bid on that report. And she refers to it as the prow of the dragon ship into Europe. all the traditional Greek workshops, the whole infrastructure of the Greek shipping industry has been hollowed out. And so in terms of the jobs and the economic development that comes with this investment, that doesn't follow, because we know that in these projects, so many of the people that are coming in and building them are actually from China. They're not developing the skills and the workforce to grow these economies. And I think we should be proud as Americans that that's always been something we have done in our aid programs, is to develop the capability of the countries where we are through investment and things. And the other thing I would like to get in the time we have is we need to have a new, really enforced mechanism for the theft of intellectual property. Right now, our penalties, our process for that is so weak that by the time a company that's been infringed goes forward, they're out of business. And one of the things I've proposed, I was told I was very radical, but I said, well, why don't we look at what happens when an importer brings contaminated food or food items that come into our country? They get banned. They can't export. If you bring in any food product, we have a great system through the FDA. Why don't we have a system whereby if there is anything in a product that involves infringed intellectual property, they're banned. They can't come in. And we can extend that around the world, because this intellectual property issue is really at the heart of a lot of what we're facing on this whole technology future. And I think we have to be very, very aggressive on it and have remedies that are imposed within 2 months of an infringement case, not wait for 5 years.
Thank you. We're going to go straight to the floor now. And that's why I wanted to end with these 2 general questions. But thank you to the panel. And I know that there was a group of young folks who had to leave, but I don't know if they want to ask their questions now. Are they here? I want to give them a first opportunity. And please understand, we have very bright lights here, so if I don't see your hand, they're right in our eyes, so if I don't see your hand. Okay. So now the floor is open. I don't see the young folks. Here is a question, and then over here. And
Sorry.
oh, there's the young folks. Please, why don't you start first?
Hi, my name is Celine, and you mentioned how we're ahead in this Cold War right now, but how do we stay ahead?
Who wants to start? How do we stay ahead in the current competition?
It takes continued engagement. I think at the end of the day, it takes continued engagement from diplomacy through our economic programs, and likewise through our military programs. I mean, if you look at projecting power outwards, that includes all 3 of the pillars of military, diplomacy, and economic engagement. And that's how we continue to remain, if not ahead, continue to push U.S. and like-minded interests and bring our partners and allies along with us.
Anyone else want to comment? Otherwise, we'll take some more questions and you can wait.
I would just say that we're on the cusp now, in less than 2 years, it's amazing, of a whole renaissance in nuclear energy. Not just refitting old plants, but these small nuclear reactors that are now being deployed.
Small modular.
Yes, and this relates to the data centers and the electricity. But if we could jumpstart that and export this capability, because quite frankly, if we're going to meet climate and everything, we're not going to have baseload energy through wind and solar. It's not going to happen. And pretty soon we're going to try to figure out how do we get rid of all these things that take a huge amount of carbon to build, et cetera. So let's move forward on being the leader now, as we were in the nuclear energy renaissance, which is really transformational.
Okay, there's 2 thoughts. There we go.
Hi, thank you. Vivian Palmer from World Affairs Council, Las Vegas. My question is, how can the United States get on brand and on messaged? I think there's a big gap, especially I will speak only about Nigeria because I haven't traveled all over Africa. But China does an excellent job in branding and messaging. You see their brand everywhere, their name everywhere, and they're really messaging that they're doing this great investment in infrastructure, et cetera. We do it, but we're so quiet about it. Why?
Robert, start.
Well, China, as you know, is a one-party authoritarian state, moving really from what had been a softening authoritarianism toward a version of techno perhaps totalitarianism, depending on where we look. 100 million members of the Communist Party, so everybody has neighbors, friends, and relatives who are in it. So it's very, very easy for them to stay on message. But in addition to the authoritarian piece, they also invest in it through global media, through everything that they do has a global public diplomacy aspect to it. We do not understand and we do not value public diplomacy. It's not something that we do very well. And also I think that the depressing but obvious answer is that we can't brand or stay on message if we don't know who we are. You know, we are so deeply divided now that I don't think we don't even know how to have this conversation in a coherent, constructive way within the United States. And that seems, to be dominant as far as the eye can see, barring something that we can't foresee. So I'm not sure what is the message? What is the brand now? We better get a little clearer about that unto ourselves before we think about serious public diplomacy to compete with China.
But I don't see everybody rushing to immigrate into China.
No, but I will say this.
Like Como, maybe. Lower Ontario.
Yeah,
But actually that's not it. That's not the right comparison. We don't know who we are. China, it's enforced. You're only allowed to be one thing, which isn't true. I can tell you from having spent years in China, they're as diverse, as we are in their viewpoints. But there is still more of a sense of pulling together, and it's not just about not immigrating. We really don't know. I mean, unless someone can stand up and tell me that I'm wrong and here's what America is. But
and it may not refract here, but it does refract around the world, where especially developing countries say, well, we don't want that bad stuff. We don't necessarily want to be totalitarianism. But boy, we certainly left to lift 40% of our population out of poverty in a generation. Boy, we'd like to be making nuclear subs. Boy, we'd like to be at the table at every international gathering and go from the 78th world economy to amongst the top 20. And so I think that aspirational thing is there. Tom, did you want to say something? Otherwise, we'll go to the next question, which I think is here.
No, go ahead and
Please.
Hi, I'm Lissa Weinman from the Wyndham World Affairs Council in Vermont. Deborah painted a very disturbing picture of what's happening with the Uyghurs in terms of AI control over human beings. Is that your view on what the world would look like should China actually emerge as the hegemon globally? So I'd like all the panelists, especially you, to comment on that. What would the world look like if China was replacing the United States as the global hegemon? There's a lot of people, I think, in the incoming administration that might want to reduce our role, so I think that's an important question.
Well, I'll just say I personally find it terrifying. And my colleagues can talk about, the social credit scores you get and all of that. I mean, they kind of know everything about you. And, I think we pride our privacy and our individual autonomy, so that's a scary future, quite frankly. But it is a laboratory, and I will say that on biological functions also, human augmentation, using CRISPR-Cas9 to do augmentation studies on primates. There's a lot of things that, science is great, it always has been, but there's a light and there's a darkness. And I think in our democracies, we're going to control the darkness much more than in an autocratic, totalitarian society.
Anyone else?
I still think and hope that's right, but I think we also need to acknowledge that we don't really know where we go with surveillance technology, AI, and all of these capabilities. This is a laboratory too. And we're about to, I think, if we take our leaders' word seriously, start to deregulate a lot of the forces that are designed to hold some of these things in check. I'm not sure where we go. I do think that when you ask, what does a world under China look like? You have to ask, what is the Chinese Communist Party's ideal of the human, of the good life? And we have to look at their own country. What do they want for their people? They want their people to be wealthy, technologically enabled, healthy, internationalized, entertained, and genuinely content under the unquestioned leadership of one party state. Okay, that's it. So it's not that they don't care about the good of the people. They do, but they limit it. They lop off the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you know what that is. And that's their vision of the human. We are homo economicus, to be wholly satisfied materially under a benevolent and unquestioned leadership that has the right to surveil us and to operate in secrecy. So that's the Chinese vision of the human, and I think that that's what they would like the global operating environment to look like.
And that's the central tussle of the global order, the human spirit versus the homo economicus. And that's, you put your finger on it, which is, those are the two futures I think we are kind of struggling over. Right. Sir.
Oh, thank you. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. I'm Richard Downey from the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. The idea that you've talked about in terms of the lack of U.S. effort at global order, I think is just really an insightful idea. We see, as you mentioned, we believe in this idea of primacy. We think the United States can do things when we really no longer have those tools. And we see this encroachment from China on all of these areas that you've mentioned. But our effort to counter that seems to be, don't go to China because there's a debt trap diplomacy or they have bad, shoddy infrastructure projects. What ought we to be doing? What can help to really kind of wake people up and to counter what the Chinese are doing? Thank you.
Who'd like to start? Tom?
Let me start from the US TDA's perspective, which is, we're on the front lines. As an agency, we are going out helping American companies where they face direct competition from China. A good example in the last number of years where we have spent a significant amount of personal resources and financial resources challenging China's expansion effort in undersea fiber optic cabling. It's no secret that there's a couple of players in the United States, there's players in the EU, and then there's Huawei Marine or HMN Technologies. I think it has been rebranded, but it's Huawei Technology, and USTDA stepped in and provided directed training for countries that were willing to take the US solution over the Chinese solution in the Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, undersea fiber optic cable. USTDA is making investments in the Central Pacific cable, connecting 12 Pacific Island countries with undersea fiber optic cabling connected to Google that's going to connect into Guam and to the mainland United States. So there are places where we see direct competition where we are stepping in. Was just talked about nuclear. USTDA is making a big play into nuclear. We're involved in the design engineering work on Poland's fleet of nuclear reactors that was awarded to Westinghouse and Bechtel. In Romania, we're working on small modular reactors where the Romanian government is committed to being the first mover for NuScale's technology. Likewise, in Indonesia, working just last week, the president of Indonesia was here meeting with President Biden, and they specifically talked about the work that USTDA is doing in small modular reactor in Indonesia. It's these technologies that are going to ensure US primacy, that we can continue to project US power through the innovation and technologies that the United States offers.
The other thing that I think we're going to see, it started, and we have, ups and downs on this. When I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce years ago, we focused a lot on the whole imperative for manufacturing. But we have to make things. We're great in software, we're still great in aerospace and much of the defense. But we have to have tax and other incentives now to really restore our manufacturing prowess across a wide range of industrial sectors, and then have our promotion and XM and things to get that out into the market space. I don't know how many of you just read, Apple's putting a huge investment now in Indonesia. I think I forget the number, but it's $30, $40 million more. I mean, it's a huge investment because the Indonesians say, we're not going to let you sell Apple phones unless you build a factory. Yeah. We need to reindustrialize the United States.
All right. And we need to also end this wonderful panel and go to your next breakout sessions. So please join me in thanking this terrific panel.